Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video with Rupa Health. My name is Dr. Sarah Ellis, and I'm so excited to join you today to talk about a very interesting subject. Today, we'll be discussing the many ways in which we can support hormonal balance within perimenopausal women. So let's get started. So during our time together, we are going to be discussing perimenopause versus menopause and understanding the differences in the stages of the transition. We'll also discuss the most common symptoms that affect perimenopausal women. And then lastly, the majority of our time together will be spent going over some clinical approaches to supporting hormonal balance. We'll talk about diet and nutrition, sleep, and botanicals. So let's talk about the phases of menopause. There are generally three phases of menopause. It starts with perimenopause, then transitions into menopause, and then postmenopause. A woman is considered to be in perimenopause when her menses begins to become a bit irregular. This is also the time where symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats begin to appear. Menopause begins once a woman has ceased having menstrual cycles for a full 12 months. The median age of this transition is around 51, but premature menopause can develop in some women, and that usually is marked by a cessation of menstrual cycles earlier than 40 years old. Now, once this woman has gone a full 12 months without having a menstrual cycle, then she is considered to be postmenopausal. And that begins as soon as she reaches her 1 year anniversary of not having a menstrual cycle. I really love the schematic because it does a great job of highlighting the length of time from perimenopause to becoming postmenopausal and beyond. So let's take a look. Of course, in our reproductive stage, this is when women have regular menstrual cycles, they have preserved fertility, regular ovulation. Right around mid 40s, the average seems to be about 47 and a half. This is when perimenopause kind of begins to take place and a woman begins to transition. So, as the ovaries begin to make less and less estrogen, her cycle begins to vary in length. So, while it may still be regular, 1 month her cycle could be 28 days, the next month it could be 45. So, when she begins to notice the change in cycle length, that could be a clue that she's entering perimenopause. During the late menopausal transition, this is when women start to see more skipped cycles, skipping 2 or more cycles or having a long interval of not having a menstrual cycle. That is definitely a sign that she is in perimenopause. Now, you may notice here that this is also the time period where symptoms begin to flare and pop up. So, hot flashes, night sweats, mood swings, and a few other symptoms tend to really impact a woman's life around this time. Then, of course, after having 12 months of no menstrual period, then she will be considered in menopause. That lasts 12 months, and then she will enter early postmenopause. So, early postmenopause is about 4 years of having no menstrual cycle, and then late postmenopause is 4 years and beyond. Now, what I really wanted to point out here is that the symptoms of perimenopause and eventually menopause begin right around late 40s, early 50s. And for some women, they do not end until their mid to late 50s. So this is nearly a decade of women experiencing these uncomfortable symptoms that do have an impact on their quality of life. So hormones, prior to menopause, more than 90% of the estrogen in a woman's body is made by her ovaries. Now, maximizing adrenal function is very important during the perimenopausal transition. And that's because our adrenal glands are able to make a little bit of estrogen. So if we can strengthen the adrenals, make sure that if they are presenting with adrenal fatigue, that we work to restore them, that can actually help them transition well throughout the menopausal years. Now, because fat cells do contain aromatase, the enzyme that is used to make estrogen, women who are overweight may actually have fewer problems with perimenopausal symptoms, and they also are at less risk of developing osteopenia and osteoporosis. Okay, let's talk about some common perimenopausal symptoms. The most common symptoms that women tend to present with include irregular periods, decreased fertility, vaginal dryness, hot flashes, sleep disturbances, mood swings, increased abdominal fat, thinning hair, and it may be hard to see behind my picture, but it says reduced breast fullness. So these are some of the most common symptoms that women are presenting to providers for support with. In October 2022, Everyday Health created a survey and asked perimenopausal and menopausal women, what symptoms really prompted you to seek treatment? And 45% of the respondents said that hot flashes was the number one reason why they sought out assistance and treatment from their providers. Next is night sweats and sleep challenges. And as you can see, the list goes on and on. Now, vasomotor symptoms, also known as hot flashes, they are the most common symptom in the menopause transition. And the World Health Organization estimates that about 21 million women in the US will experience vasomotor symptoms by 2025. What's important to note is, as a practitioner, is that women are searching for effective and safe integrative tools to support their journey throughout menopause. So before I talk about the different ways that diet and nutrition and sleep and botanicals can help with hot flashes, let's kind of learn a little bit about the vasomotor symptoms and the impact that they can have on a woman's life. So, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, these symptoms and hot flashes can last for 7 to 10 years. And women with symptoms early in perimenopause, early in the transition, tend to have these hot flashes for the longest. What's interesting in the research is that Black women often have hot flashes for even longer than a decade. And so, if you are working with African American women, it is very important to address these, as they are often experiencing these symptoms longer than their counterparts. What's also interesting is that vasomotor symptoms have been found to be more frequent and more severe after surgical hysterectomy, even with ovarian preservation. Now, I really love this image here because it discusses and kind of highlights the way that our brain controls our thermal regulation, or our temperature, and how the presence and lack of estrogen impacts our brain's ability to read our temperature correctly. So here in the premenopause, we see that this thermoneutral zone, this is kind of the zone where you're not extremely hot and you're also not extremely cold. You can see with premenopausal women, so these are women with fully functioning ovaries that are producing sufficient amounts of estrogen. You'll see that this thermoneutral zone here is quite large. There's quite a wide gap where our brain is able to help and regulate our temperature in a way that we aren't experiencing two extremes temperature experience. But we see here in postmenopause, after our estrogen levels have decreased, we notice that the thermoneutral zone has also decreased as well. So it's even more difficult for our brain to recognize when we are in a neutral temperature or when we're experiencing flushing and sweating and even chills and shivering. As I mentioned, these hot flashes do have a severe impact on women's quality of life. So hot flashes can have an impact on sleep duration, quality, and continuity. It can have an impact on mood decline. It reduces a woman's ability to participate in social and professional activities, and it also is associated with a reduced cognitive function. Now, hot flashes also increases a woman's risk of coronary artery disease and is associated with low bone density and fracture. So now that we've had a good background on perimenopause versus menopause, and also discussing the number one symptom that perimenopausal women complain about, which is vasomotor symptoms and hot flashes. So now that we have that foundation set, let's get into the fun part, which is the clinical approaches. So now today, specifically, we're going to talk about diet and nutrition and how they play a role in the perimenopausal transition, and also different nutrients to prioritize when working with perimenopausal women. So there are a variety of nutritional needs for women in perimenopause, and that's because menopause is associated with an increased prevalence of obesity, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and osteoporosis. As I mentioned in a couple of slides ago, estrogen does affect our central nervous system, so our brain and our spine, but it also has an impact on our metabolism. So it can increase not only our food intake, but our basal metabolism. So you can imagine what a decrease in estrogen production can do to a woman's metabolism and ability to utilize her food in a healthy way. Now, changes in diet can help the body adjust to these physiological changes that happen and are associated with the decrease in estradiol. So, when addressing your client and patient's diet, it is very important to prioritize the following nutrients: vitamin D, vitamin K2, vitamin C, B vitamins, protein, and fiber. Specifically today, I'm going to share some details on the importance of vitamin D, vitamin K2, and fiber. Now, of course, there are foods that we want to avoid. These are foods that have been shown to exacerbate hot flashes and other perimenopausal symptoms. So animal fats and meat and dairy should be reduced and, if possible, avoided. And that is because these foods can be considered inflammatory. And by stimulating the pro-inflammatory cytokines, it is possible that it can worsen the woman's perimenopausal symptoms. We also want to make sure that she's avoiding refined carbohydrates and sugars, alcohol, caffeine, and spicy foods. So as I mentioned, there are a number of nutrients that you want to prioritize in perimenopausal women, including minerals like calcium and magnesium. I do want to put an asterisk here about calcium and make a note that we're focusing on dietary calcium and not necessarily supplemental calcium. Vitamins include vitamins D, E, and C, of course, a B complex, and K2. And then in terms of macronutrients, we always want to choose low refined carbohydrates, high quality protein, and another important supplement is also omega-3 fatty acids for their anti-inflammatory activity. So let's talk about vitamin D. Well, with aging, the rate of hydroxylation of vitamin D on the surface of our skin it actually decreases. So our body, as we get older, becomes less efficient in producing enough vitamin D. Now, this is important because vitamin D is more than really a vitamin, it's a prohormone and plays a role in hundreds of different reactions and processes in our body. It also has been shown to enhance the efficacy of osteoporosis treatment. And if you're working with perimenopausal women, especially those who have osteopenia or osteoporosis, it's going to be very important to keep an eye on their vitamin D status and make sure that they are within healthy ranges. Vitamin D status also influences our calcium absorption. So remember, we're focusing on calcium sources from food and nutrition. And so vitamin D is just going to further support our ability to absorb and utilize calcium in a healthy way. Dietary sources of vitamin D include soft-boned fish like sardines, pickled herring, and anchovy, cod liver oil, salmon, swordfish, tuna, eggs, mushrooms, but they contain D2, and cheese. Now, this study was published in 2020, and it's a really fascinating study that draws a connection between vitamin D status and vasomotor symptoms. So this study looked at 210 postmenopausal women, and they split them up into two groups. One half represented women with hot flashes, about 104 of them, and then the other half were postmenopausal women that did not have hot flashes. During this study, they measured their vitamin D status and found that 50% of the women in the hot flash group had a low vitamin D status. In fact, their vitamin D levels were 20 nanograms per mil, and a healthy range really ranges anywhere from 50 to 75. And so these women were quite vitamin D deficient. But what they also saw is that women that did not have hot flashes, there were really only about 25% of them that were considered vitamin D deficient. So this study really was able to draw a significant correlation between vitamin D status and the experience of vasomotor symptoms. Now, what I wanted to also highlight and draw a connection to, you may recall a couple of slides ago, that it said that Black women tend to experience hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms for a significantly longer period of time than their counterparts. What's also true is that African Americans also tend to be more vitamin D deficient. And so again, if you're working with African American women who are going through the perimenopausal transition, it is going to be critical to check their vitamin D status and make sure you are supplementing them in a way to help them reach healthy vitamin D levels. All right, let's talk about vitamin K2. Now, vitamin K2 and vitamin D work so well together. I actually like to call them calcium's Uber drivers. So whenever we're eating, a source of calcium in our diet, vitamin D helps us to absorb it better. And then vitamin K2 kind of drives it around into the parts of the body where it's supposed to be. So it takes it out of our vasculature, which can lead to hardening of the arteries or stenosis, and it deposits it directly into our bones and our teeth. Now, I wanted to highlight the difference between vitamin K1 and vitamin K2 because there is a difference. So most of us, when we think of vitamin K, we think of vitamin K1 here on the left. So vitamin K1 is usually found in dark leafy greens, but vitamin K2 is a different form of K2. So K1 is known as phyloquinone, and K2 is known as menaquinone. Now, menaquinone, the shorter chains of this vitamin, is usually found in meats, animal foods, eggs, dairy, that sort of thing. But the longer chains of the menaquinone, so which really have been shown to have a longer half-life and do a greater job of helping to direct calcium into our skeletal bones. So these longer chains are actually found in more fermented foods. So a common Japanese snack, natto, is fermented soybeans and is very, very rich in vitamin K2, but also certain cheeses and fermented foods also have vitamin K2. So why is K2 important? As I mentioned a few moments ago, it is responsible for directing calcium into our bones and our teeth. And it does that by activating certain proteins. It activates matrix GLA protein in the vasculature and osteocalcin. So it activates matrix GLA protein in the heart and osteocalcin in the bones. And it helps facilitate the absorption of calcium into the bony matrix to help rebuild and strengthen the bony matrix within the bone. Vitamin K2 has also been shown to reduce arterial stiffness in postmenopausal women. So this study was performed in 2015, and it was very interesting, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and it was designed to really assess the long-term effects of supplementing vitamin K2 in the vasculature of healthy postmenopausal women. So they looked at over 200 women and split them into two groups. One half were given 180 micrograms of MK7 or menaquinone K2, and the other 124 received a placebo. And they followed them for 3 years. And what they found is that over the course of 3 years, the women who had already started had a baseline of elevated arterial stiffness. They saw a significant reduction in their arterial stiffness score, which showed that over a long period of time, taking 180 micrograms of MK7 has the potential to reduce arterial stiffness in women who are already presenting with elevated levels of arterial stenosis. Now let's talk about fiber and perimenopause. So we've talked about a couple of micronutrients, the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D and K2. But I wanted to really take a moment to talk about fiber because fiber is so incredibly important. By increasing fiber intake, we are able to reduce the woman's risk of developing metabolic syndrome. Adding dietary fiber can help create a positive effect on the gut microbiome and improves microbial diversity. Now, having a diet full of fiber can actually prevent sharp insulin spikes and having irregular glucose levels throughout the day. Because having a glucose dysregulation is associated with hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms. Now, we want to aim for about 30 grams of fiber a day, but it's very important to go low and slow and titrate your way up to that amount of fiber, particularly if a woman is transitioning from a lower fiber diet into a high fiber diet. So let's talk about sources of dietary fiber. Fruits like berries, avocado, apples, and pears. Cereals like barley, oats, bran, and quinoa. I'll put an asterisk here, if someone is gluten-free, of course, there's no pressure to include, or we actually do not recommend at all, to include gluten-containing grains, but there are a number of whole grains that are gluten-free that can contribute to supporting a healthy gut microbiome and providing sufficient amounts of fiber. Nuts, seeds, legumes are also great sources of dietary fiber. And of course, we cannot forget the brassica family of veggies. So broccoli, arugula, bok choy, all of our favorites. And there are many, many, many more sources of dietary fiber. All right, let's talk about sleep. So now that we know what foods to prioritize for our patients and clients, now let's talk about ways that we can support a woman's sleep. As we talked about previously, sleep disturbances are probably the second most common or third most common symptom that women tend to complain about during perimenopause and menopause. In fact, postmenopausal women are less satisfied with their sleep, and as many as 61% actually report insomnia. Now, the etiology of the sleep disturbances is still being elucidated, honestly. Most believe that it's associated with the hot flashes and night sweats, but 50% of the time, it's not associated with that. We do know that having sleep disturbances does affect adrenal recovery time, which can impact a woman's energy levels and the presence of brain fog. And also, we wanted to note that women who also struggle with sleep disturbances tend to present with mood changes as well. So they're more likely to experience anxiety and depression. So, what can we do to support a woman's sleep? Of course, the first step, I always walk through sleep hygiene. So, really doing a conscious effort to prepare their home and their body for sleep. So usually I encourage them to start about an hour before they actually want to be in bed. And in terms of preparing their home, I'm encouraging them to dim the lights, turn off any TVs, any sources of extra noise or bright light, playing any calming music, and really just encouraging the body to prepare to shut down. Then, of course, making sure that their room is distraction free, that it's at a cooler temperature and quite dark. The darkness is important because it helps signal our brain to begin to decrease our cortisol levels and increase melatonin in preparation for sleep. Now, of course, if a woman is in menopause and she already has been pretty diligent about her sleep hygiene, there are other things and other resources that we can use. So what we see here is there are a number of botanicals and supplements that we can use. Botanicals include valerian, kava, passiflora or passion flower, humulus or hops, and we'll talk about that one in a couple of slides, matricaria or chamomile, and avena or wild oat. All of these herbs are so great for sedation, for rest, for promoting a balanced circadian rhythm. I do want to note that valerian can be stimulating in some women. So don't be surprised if you recommend a valerian tincture or tea and they come back and tell you that they were kind of wired that night. For whatever reason, they are one of the stimulating responders to valerian, but fortunately, there are a number of other herbs that can be used to support her sleep. Supplements can be very important as well. So 5-HTP, which is a precursor for serotonin and melatonin, at a dose of 100 to 200 milligrams at night, that can also help facilitate better sleep. Melatonin is also another supplement at about 3 milligrams. Phosphatidylserine is a very interesting option because it has a great job of reducing elevated cortisol. And so if your client is going through perimenopause and is under high stress and has elevated nighttime cortisol, phosphatidylserine could be a great supplement to include to help counteract that elevated cortisol at night. Glycine is also a great option, but really the root cause to addressing and improving sleep is to stop the night sweats. And speaking of night sweats, let's talk about botanicals. Now, I've mentioned a couple of herbs already, particularly as it pertains to sleep, but these herbs that we'll be discussing today will be specifically for hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms, night sweats, those sorts of symptom pictures. Now, when using botanicals for perimenopausal symptom relief, it's important to know that botanicals and herbs can act through a number of different mechanisms. So that could include estrogenic activity, progestogenic activity, and even serotonergic pathways. Now, again, the most common symptoms that are addressed with botanicals include vasomotor symptoms, sleep disturbances, as well as mood imbalances. Now, this list here is far from exhaustive, but these are some of the more common botanicals used to address perimenopausal symptoms. We have red clover, black cohosh, licorice, kudzu, hops, rhubarb, wild yam, vitex agnus castus, dong quai, and sage. So during our time today, this last section, we are going to be talking about red clover, black cohosh, licorice, and hops. Red clover, a beautiful, gorgeous flower, also known as Trifolium pratense. Now, red clover contains lots of isoflavones. So these are phytoestrogenic compounds that are pretty structurally similar to estrogen, and they have the ability to bind to the estrogen receptors. What's really cool about red clover and its isoflavones, genistein and diadzine, and S equal, those three isoflavones prefer to bind to the anti-inflammatory estrogen receptor beta. And that's important because by activating estrogen receptor alpha, you're more likely to activate the inflammatory processes associated with the presence of estrogen. Now, the research has presented mixed results with regard to red clover's effectiveness in hot flashes. In some studies, we found that doses of 40 to 80 milligrams a day actually was able to reduce hot flashes by 50%. But then there are other studies that showed no benefit. So one of my beliefs is that the botanicals definitely need more research, more robust and well-designed research to really highlight their efficacy and safety. But what's really exciting is that red clover was shown to not stimulate endometrial thickness. And that's something that as practitioners we should be concerned about when choosing to support a woman during perimenopause. Because if we are introducing estrogenic compounds, we want to make sure that they are not able to stimulate endometrial thickening, which can increase a woman's risk of endometrial cancer. All right, black cohosh. Let's talk about this age-old beauty. Also known as Cimicifuga racemosa or Actea racemosa. Now, there have been at least 12 or 11 clinical trials that have assessed the efficacy for the symptomatic treatment of menopausal symptoms since 1982. So this is one of the most well-researched and well-studied herbs as it pertains to menopause and perimenopause. Now, much like red clover, the efficacy is kind of unclear. So there are a lot of studies and mixed results. Some studies found that black cohosh did a great job of reducing hot flashes in the presence of vasomotor symptoms, and other studies showed no benefit. Now, there is a low risk potential when using black cohosh, and also they found that there was no effect on a variety of hormones when using black cohosh. So black cohosh did not impact luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, estradiol, prolactin, or even sex hormone binding globulin. Now, this is such an interesting study that I wanted to share. It compared Cimicifuga or black cohosh to conjugated estrogen. So conjugated estrogens are usually the prescriptive hormone replacement therapy. And in this double-blind placebo-controlled study, they found that black cohosh was equally as effective as Premarin, which is our prescription conjugated estrogen. And it was equal to Premarin in reducing hot flashes. At 40 milligrams, it was just as effective as 0.625 milligrams of Premarin for 3 months. What they found is they also measured endometrial thickness, and black cohosh had no effect on endometrial thickness, while Premarin actually did increase the uterine lining. Now, what's interesting to note is that, again, one of the symptoms that women complain about is vaginal dryness. Now, Premarin was better at improving vaginal lubrication. It did a much more effective job at resolving that symptom complaint better than black cohosh. But what this study suggests is that black cohosh and the compounds present within black cohosh is possibly a SERM or a selective estrogen receptor modulator. So again, there's so much more research that needs to be done to really elucidate the effectiveness and safety and mechanisms of action of these herbs. Now let's talk about licorice. Now, licorice is a widely used plant. It's often used as a sweetener, but it has a variety of clinical applications. It is anti-inflammatory, it has phytoestrogenic activity, and is also known as an adaptogen that helps us manage our stress levels. Now, several species of licorice have been known to produce weak phytoestrogens. Now, the research again shows mixed results in its ability to reduce hot flashes. Now, I also wanted to note that long-term use of a licorice extract does have the potential to increase blood pressure. So, if you're working with perimenopausal and menopausal women who do have hypertension, you will want to opt for a deglycerinated version. So, that involves an extraction process that removes glycyrrhizin from the licorice extract. And glycyrrhizin is the compound that is responsible for the elevation in blood pressure. All right, now let's talk about hops. So, hops is not just good for beer, it is also great for a number of other options, including helping with sleep. It's very well known for its sleep inducing effects, and it also has phytoestrogenic activity. So, it has compounds, several compounds, in fact, that have phytoestrogenic activity, and they can also bind to both receptors, estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. What is interesting is that hops has one of the most potent phytoestrogens to date, known as 8-PN or 8-prenylnaringenin. 8-PN is known to be very potent, and what's special about this compound is that it is equipotent for both estrogen receptor subtypes. So that means that it is able to activate both estrogen receptor alpha and beta equally. Whereas if you recall, red clover tends to prefer to bind to beta, estrogen receptor beta over alpha. Now, this 2016 study found that when they studied 120 different postmenopausal and perimenopausal women, they measured their vasomotor symptom score, their green score, and their mean vasomotor symptom score was significantly lower in the groups that were taking the HOP supplement compared to the placebo group. And that reduction was consistent throughout the 12 weeks of the study. So at weeks 4, 8, and 12, they saw a consistent decrease in their vasomotor symptom score. What's also important to note is that the number of hot flashes was also significantly lower in the HOPS group at weeks 4 and weeks 12. Now, I wanted to make sure that I touched on a subject that I'm sure a number of you are thinking about, where we are concerned about phytoestrogens. Should we be worried about phytoestrogens and their ability to increase a woman's risk of breast cancer, or especially if they have a personal or family history of estrogen receptor positive breast cancer? I will say that when working with patients with a history of breast cancer, I am very, very conservative when working with phytoestrogenic activity or phytoestrogenic botanicals. So please be sure to use caution and avoid them if you feel as though they would increase your patient's risk. But I wanted to make sure that I note that even though they are phytoestrogenic, they bind to the estrogen receptor at significantly higher concentrations compared to estrogen. So I wanted to make sure that I highlighted the fact that they are nowhere near as potent as estradiol. So let's take a look at this graph here. This graph is actually from my own research in graduate school. When I was attending the University of Illinois at Chicago, I studied botanical dietary supplements. And specifically, I looked at these herbs and their ability to bind to estrogen receptors alpha and beta. And what we found in the research is that these herbs bind at significantly less specificity and potency as estradiol. So as we look at this black curve here, this is estrogen. And we can see that estrogen is able to induce and bind to the estrogen receptor alpha really at nanomolar concentration. So it only takes a very, very small amount of estrogen to fully bind these receptors. But if we take a look here at these herbs, so in green, this is hops, and red, this is red clover, and then these three are three different species of licorice. And as you can see, hops is able to induce, 100-fold activity or binding to the estrogen receptor. However, the dose in which it does that is really mole or millimolar concentrations, significantly more than what is required for estradiol. Same for red clover, and licorice also requires an even greater concentration. So the ability of these herbs to cause an overstimulation of activation of the estrogen receptor, the risk of that is quite low. Now, I also wanted to highlight that unlike pharmaceuticals, herbs contain several different compounds that all work together synergistically to provide a wide array of physiological activities. So, for example, you remember earlier that I said that licorice or Glycyrrhiza glabra, it has a lot of clinical applications. That's because it doesn't just have just one compound. It has hundreds of different compounds, some of which are anti-inflammatory, some of which are estrogenic, and others are adaptogenic. So it's important to remember when using botanicals, you aren't just getting one compound, you are getting a host of compounds that all work together to provide a wide array of symptom relief. So in summary, perimenopause and menopause is a phase of a woman's life that requires the same level of attention and care as puberty, fertility, and other special moments in a woman's life. Millions of women every year are looking for holistic and integrative options for managing their perimenopausal symptoms. Now, when creating a treatment plan for your patients and clients, it is so important, it is critical to make sure that you are considering nutrition, lifestyle, supplements, and botanicals as different modalities to use to support them. And what's important to note is that caring for the whole woman allows you, the practitioner, to provide a more comprehensive treatment plan that is more likely to be successful in managing the variety of symptoms that occur during peri and postmenopause. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you had a wonderful time together as I did. Thank you so much for joining us at Rupa Health. I'll see you next time.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.